You were never intended to be here. The world was designed to keep you tiny, to convince you that power belonged exclusively to those who were born into it. That power was inherited, not claimed. They established the rules before you had a voice, shaping reality in their image, assuring that you, ordinary, invisible, and disposable, will never ascend. But here, you are not just seen and heard, but unstoppable. You were informed that the modification was impossible, that struggle was fruitless, that those who controlled from the shadows would always have control of the planet. They banked on your quiet, mistrust, and terror. But they never realized that you were never waiting for permission. You were never intended to follow. You were designed to break the pattern, rewrite the script, and make the unthinkable a reality. And now, as they sit in their hidden cells, their hands quivering over reports, they can no longer deny the truth, which pounds down on them like an unknown weight. They are losing the game that they have perfected over centuries. Has been disturbed. The illusion they created is shattering, and for the first time, they are the ones terrified because the world is no longer theirs. It belongs to you. They gathered urgently, their features pulled tight with silent anxiety. For years, they had determined the path of existence, but suddenly something was sliding out of grasp. They had not accounted for their might. Once absolute began to fragment, the forces they had previously rejected as inconsequential were no longer dispersed or impotent. You were once simply another single figure burdened down by a structure designed to keep you in servitude. But there was something about you that couldn't be quantified, something beyond their calculation. It was neither hereditary status nor material excess. It was an unwavering drive and urge to persevere, to press on while all others recoiled and paused. You stepped in where resignation was anticipated. Defiance took root. They had seen fights and revolutions from the safety of their lofty towers. This time, however, things were different. This time, the barriers they had constructed to maintain control were revealing cracks. Dear brothers and sisters, may God's peace be with you. Remember this fact. Our lives are based on His divine design. Give without regard for worldly problems, as Scripture commands, and it will be handed to you. Luke 638. Like a gigantic oak, we believe in His strength. When you utilize the super, you will be able to tap into that blessing. Click the thank you button and contribute $100. Know that His fullness will come back to you 100-fold. At first, it was subtle, like an ember against the huge machinery of repression. But sparks spread, and the fire became evident. Words were transformed into action, and stillness became resistance. The very institutions that had regulated reality for millennia and started to erode the illusions they had spent decades constructing crumbled as incontrovertible realities surfaced from underneath the surface. You had refused to meet their expectations, had ripped through the carefully crafted foundation that guaranteed their continuing rule. Worst of all, for them, you weren't alone anymore. The individual voices that had previously been rejected as inconsequential now echoed together, producing something they could neither control nor contain with the means of their rule. The fear manipulation division started to disintegrate under the weight of something larger. They are now reviewing the data, studies, and estimates that they formerly believed. This was clearly not a statistical abnormality or an outlier to be disregarded. It was a change in the tide. They had no way of stopping. They began to sneer, not in public, not publicly, but in the seclusion of their safe environments, behind opulent coverings and murmured pledges. They'd faced problems before and always found a way to quiet them. To them, you were simply another transient disruption, another movement that would rise and fall before becoming irrelevant. They had rewrote history to bury anyone who had dared to resist them before. Why should this occasion be any different? They rejected the momentum, wrath, and sheer resolve as nothing more than a natural cycle, a fleeting flash before extinction. After all, how could someone without money, influence, or established authority demolish the world's architects? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. 118 verse 22. They believed they had everything sorted out. The builders of power, those who constructed this world in their image, had persuaded themselves that they knew how it would end. They'd seen it before. Opposition building just to fade away like a candle in a storm. It was foreseeable and unavoidable. They convinced themselves that every insurrection, uprising, and flash of defiance would shatter under the weight of the system. They had perfected, so why wouldn't they trust it? For generations, they perched above it all, observing as challenges were gobbled up. As moves burnt brightly and rapidly, they found it humorous that others continued attempting. Fighting a machine too powerful to break against an empire too big to collapse. They had established their dominion via riches, power, and control. They had established the rules and ensured that no one else had the authority to modify them. But what happens when the stone they rejected and the power they disregarded become the very basis of something new? What happens to the ones that are overlooked? Have the ones they never accounted for stopped following their rules? They began to watch from a distance, confident that this, too, would pass. That you would disappear into another forgotten conflict. They thought time would do the job for them, and all they had to do was wait. And you'd crumble under the strain, fall in line, and vanish. But you didn't. The fire did not go out. The storm did not subside. The weight they used to crush you made you stronger. They had seen disturbance before, but not like this. They had seen demonstrations, movements, and opposition, but never a force that refused to break, evolved, and developed beyond their capacity to govern the system they had spent their whole lives establishing. The one they had always relied on was suddenly slipping through their grasp. The barriers they created to hold power and you in place were beginning to break. They were not just up against opponents. They were dealing with something considerably worse. They were confronting an unmistakable, irrevocable transformation. The game they believed they had mastered was unraveling in ways they hadn't expected. They believed the patterns, relied on the strategies, and fed the world falsehoods for years. None of it worked anymore. For the first time, the tale deviated from the screenplay they had drafted. Their assurance had failed them, and for the first time, they weren't in charge. And now, as they congregate around their perfectly prepared numbers and polished tales of strange feelings, a sense of worry creeps in. They had long imagined themselves immune to what they had dismissed as a mere flicker, but it had grown into something irrefutable, something that would not be controlled. It had started gently, with a solitary anomaly hidden deep inside their carefully regulated systems. They believed the divergence was a fluke, but then there were more. Anomalies do not occur in exact sequence. This was not an accident. This was not an isolated breach. This was the fracturing of something they had previously considered indestructible. The most disconcerting revelation is that the force is disintegrating. It had never been part of their equation. You were never intended to be here. I never intended to disturb. Never intended to touch the levers that had been reinforced over centuries. Yet here you were, peeling away the layers, demolishing their secret structures, and revealing the flaws. They had taken great care in disguising. You're here for a purpose. If you feel called, answer it. Click. Join to get access to rare information, in-depth insights, and a strong community. This is not just a membership. It is an awakening. Step into your divine mission. Join the chosen. They remained still while one of their most powerful tools was demolished, not by an equally wealthy empire, nor by an elite enemy with equivalent might, but by something they had ignored for ages. A voice. One voice. Unshaken and unrelenting. The same individuals they'd spent decades molding were no longer following the route laid out for them. Doubt slipped into the seams of their formerly faultless control. The revelation stabbed at them in the dark light of their lofty rooms, in the frigid silence of meetings when even the air seemed to betray their trust. Their power had never been tested like this, not via force or conflict, but by something more deadly. The disintegration of the delusion that you had not come to seek for a position in their hierarchy, or to wait for permission to be granted. You had demolished the foundation itself. They're breaking through the barricades they thought were impregnable before. And now, for the first time, they felt something unfamiliar settle into the gaps between them. A lack of certainty, an acknowledgement of vulnerability. Their castle was not as unassailable as they had thought. A fracture had developed. You continued to push ahead. No weapon made against you will flourish, and you will condemn every mouth that rises against you in judgment. Isaiah 5417. They never believed you'd go this far. They constructed this universe like a castle, brick by brick, law by law, deceit after deceit, making certain that no one, not you, could ever oppose their authority. They convinced themselves that their authority was divine, that it was etched into the fabric of history, and that nothing could rock the earth under them. Their rule was total, and their control was unshakable. That was the case for a long time. But power does not exist until people believe in it. And now, that belief is dissolving. They told you that opposition was futile, that the weight of the system would crush you, that you'd get exhausted and fall in line like everyone else. They anticipated your tiredness. They relied on your submission. What they didn't anticipate was your perseverance. They never realized you weren't simply another voice or face in the throng. You weren't a transient uprising or a brief interruption. You were something different altogether. They constructed their dominion by dividing and separating people, on preventing the people from realizing their actual might. They wanted people to fight each other so they wouldn't consider fighting them. But something has changed. You saw through it. You realized that their biggest fear was not your rage, not your disobedience, not even your resistance. No. What worried me the most was the thought of you all coming together, standing side by side, not as adversaries, but as something unshakable. What happened once you realized there was no stopping? They tried everything: distraction, manipulation, and terror. But nothing worked. Every time they attempted to quiet you, your voice became louder. Every time they attempted to eliminate you, your existence grew more pronounced. They believed they could control the narrative, twisting the reality into any form they desired. However, the carefully manufactured illusion began to crumble in front of their eyes. Their supporters, who had supported them for decades, were hesitant. The institutions they had established were collapsing under the weight of a reality they could no longer bear. Their immaculate system, which had previously served them well, was collapsing. And, for the first time, they are not the ones determining the path of history. They lived their lives thinking they were untouchable, capable of bending reality to their will. But they were mistaken, because no amount of money, no amount of control, no well-crafted legislation, or closely guarded secret could prevent what was coming. They are well aware of this. They can feel it in the way their grasp is loosening, the universe is changing, and their own strength is beginning to turn against them. They have dominated for generations using control, but you don't need control. They've built an empire on terror. But don't be afraid, because what you have, what you've always had, is something they'll never be able to take away. That is why, no matter what they do next, no matter how hard they try to hang on, they are waging a struggle they have already lost. For the first time in history, they were not together to plot, dictate the destiny of industries, or demolish them. Another growing difficulty for calculated precision. No, they were preoccupied with just one issue tonight. You are their voices. When they eventually spoke, their words lacked the authority of untouchable kings. However, there is tension among people standing on unsteady ground. This was no transitory blip, no small uprising to be crushed in its infancy. This was not something they had planned for. They refused to think it was feasible. And if we don't act now, we will lose everything. The admission sent a shiver across the room. Never before had they had to consider the potential of failure. Never before had they spoken the words that suddenly felt harsh on their lips, the same dread they had used as a weapon for millennia. The same terror that had kept whole civilizations in check was now gazing back at them in their own mirrors. The most horrifying fact of all, they had no idea what they were up against, since you were impossible to trace or confine. You were more than just a force they could outmaneuver. Not just an ideology, They could portray you as something considerably worse for them because you were unavoidable. The weight of realization pushed on the walls, thickening the air as voices battled in ferocious dispute. The future no longer yielded to them. It had slipped beyond their grasp. Panic had given place to cool, controlled haste. Fear, although remaining in the corners, had been pushed aside in favor of something far more deadly. Strategy. They'd never been in this situation before, compelled to defend themselves and scramble for what little control remained. Despite the fact that the rules had altered, they were still unable to accept loss. We still have alternatives. The words sliced through the conflict. Steady, authoritative desperation was not an alternative. Not yet. The empire had been methodically built. Deception is weaved into its basis. Control is supported via invisible chains. They had been through upheaval before. I have seen movements rise and fall like the tide, always managed to remain above the waves. The issue was not whether they could detain you, but how. Some in the room continued to use traditional ways. Their voices were harsh with frustration, crushing them completely and shutting them out. Dismantle all they stand for, financially, socially, and physically, if needed. We have done this previously, but some knew better. The standard strategies were failing. Every constraint had just fueled your determination. Every effort to silence you had increased your presence. The more they pressed on you, the stronger you became. Direct confrontation was no longer an option. We can't tackle them head-on. That is precisely what they anticipate. The murmurs of agreement started softly and gradually gained speed. If repression no longer worked, maybe corruption would be a more sinister option. Divide them. Redirect their energies. Turn their oneness into conflict. Elevate the appropriate voices. Give them influence, security, power. Make them feel they are unique from the others. Find the leaders, those who talk the loudest, and whisper in their ears. Convince them that they can climb above their situation. And if persuasion failed, there was always another approach. Transform them into something the whole world would dread. Let the public seek loss, not revolution. Shift the narrative such that their movement became the same thing they were fighting against. The approach was established. The conflict had not ended, but for the first time, they were no longer controlling the terms. Nothing is hidden that will not be made known. There is nothing hidden that will not be discovered and made public. Luke 8:17. They believed they could keep their secrets concealed. They believed that if they controlled the narrative, they could control the world. But if they determined who the villains and heroes were, no one would ever challenge them. For decades, they wielded the pen that wrote history, manipulating reality to fit their purpose. The truth was never about what was real. It was about what they announced. Real. It was about what they led the world to believe. They were excellent at it. When individuals get too near to the reality, they altered the script. They did not strike down those who rose up and refused to kneel. Not straight away. No, they turned the world against them. They spoke into the appropriate ears, planted the correct rumors, and ensured that by the time the truth reached the masses, it had been so twisted and warped that no one believed it anymore. And they would watch, from their castles and secret rooms, while decent men were ripped apart by people they had attempted to rescue. It had worked previously. It had always worked previously. However, something was different this time. The atmosphere in the room remained one of calculation rather than hesitation. There was no fear. Not yet. Because terror was reserved for those who had lost control, and they'd spent their lives perfecting the art of domination. The hush that crept over them was not one of doubt. It was a strategy. They didn't panic. They were planning. Because if they cannot stop you, they may turn you against yourself. We do not need to battle them. We merely need to get them to fight each other. The words had significance not because they were new, but because they were familiar. This was an old trick, a tried and tested strategy. Division was always the solution. Make them doubt each other. Make them doubt. Allow paranoia to do the job for them. All they needed to do was wait. But what they didn't realize, and still refused to accept, was that the rules had changed. This was not the world they had dominated for centuries. The techniques that had previously succeeded were suddenly becoming ineffective. Every falsehood they said was collapsing quicker than they could weave another one. Every illusion they crafted was unraveling in the light of day. The whispers they used to create perception were suddenly working against them because people were no longer mindlessly listening. Their strength was not waning. It was collapsing. The more they attempted to manipulate the facts, the more people saw through them. Every manipulation, well-placed rumor, and carefully choreographed treachery was backfiring in ways they had never expected. They had always assumed that they were untouchable, unaffected by consequences. But now they were seeing the reality. The same weapons they had used for so long. The methods that had previously been their greatest strength were now their biggest vulnerability. And for the first time, they were not in control. For the first time, they were being undone. They worked in the shadows, feeling that anonymity was their greatest asset. What they didn't realize was that their every action had previously been planned out. You had anticipated their arrival as they muttered tactics behind shut doors. They had every possible advantage. Wealth beyond measure enables organizations to wield influence at all levels of society. Even yet, they were losing. They couldn't understand why. Because you had an intangible quality, something beyond their grasp. They had spent their lives thinking that power should be kept. Something real, quantifiable, with assets protected behind high walls and guarded gates. However, the power they were up against did not exist inside those boundaries. It could not be kept or possessed, could not be stolen. It thrived in defiance and resilience, with an unbreakable will that no amount of manipulation could destroy. Control has always been their weapon. However, it was also their vulnerability. They controlled with terror, but fear had lost its hold. They wielded division like a sword, but unity had softened the sharpness. They had perfected the art of corruption, but now faced something they couldn't taint. And now, as they clung to a world that was passing through their fingers, the reality was apparent. They were not trying to topple or subjugate another kingdom or system. They were up against something quite different, a movement that sought something bigger than rule and power. And this made it unstoppable. Strength was never a permanent condition, only in the illusion of it. They had constructed an empire based on perception, on the assumption that their authority was unbreakable. That challenge to their power was fruitless. However, when that illusion was examined, cracks occurred where none should have been. Every economic, political, and social structure they had built was failing in unexpected ways. The structures they formerly controlled now elicit distrust rather than devotion. The terror they had bred for centuries was suddenly turning against them, like a weight weighing them down. Instead of keeping everyone in line, they'd spent their lives creating a world in which their authority was absolute. A monument stands tall because no one has ventured to question its basis. But now the gaps couldn't be ignored. The cornerstones of their rule were no longer stable. Alliances that had previously been unshakable were disintegrating. Long-buried secrets were now coming to light. They were witnessing their creation crumble. And this time, there was no way to repair it. It was never about surrendering control. It was about the globe finally realizing that their power was never genuine to begin with. And once revealed, it could never be repaired. Because authority is only as powerful as the beliefs that support it. And you had broken that illusion forever. The truth had burst through their carefully planned illusion. They were not untouchable, heavenly builders of the world's fate, but rather desperate men attempting to save what had already been lost. Their period was coming to an end. Only one issue remained. What would take its place? This time, the solution did not belong to them. Decisions have been made. The conference was coming to an end, but there was no settlement. Only a peaceful sense of the upcoming conflict. They understood what they needed to do to restore their dwindling hold on the globe. You understood what needed to be done to break free once and for all, and this moment would be the one that determined everything. They would not give up easy. Desperation made them dangerous. Every weapon at their disposal, deception, infiltration, and sabotage would be used against you. They would modify the tale as it evolved, portraying themselves as the victims and you as the threat. They would distort reality to make the world doubt what you stood for. Their purpose was simple: to make you question yourself and feel that success was a fantasy. The battle had already been lost, but you'd seen too much to be fooled again. The dread with which they had dominated for centuries had shifted hands, and now, as the last encounter came, one doubt remained. Will history remember this as the last battle of a dying planet, or the beginning of something altogether new? The old was vanishing, but the new had yet to take shape. The conclusion was unwritten, and in the end, just one question remained. Who will wield the pen?